Right Side Broadcasting has it up. Okay, that's Right Side Broadcast. Oh wait, this I'm gonna share theirs. And it's like that. That's what I'm sharing on mine. How do I share this link?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today for this presentation by the Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society. I want to thank the Thomas More Society for their support. I'm Mark Serrano with Proactive Communications. Just a reminder, please, to exhibit social distancing, wear your masks as you move about the room. We are coming live to you today as well, live streaming, and we welcome everyone for their time, giving us their time today. You will see through our press release that we are providing our documents, our slides, and the report that we're announcing today at got-freedom.org, got-freedom.org. And we thank you for joining us for this very important announcement as we release a new report about the influence of Mark Zuckerberg's dark money network in the 2020 election. Leading our presentation today will be the director of the Amistad Project, Phil Klein.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. And thank all of you for attending. I appreciate your attendance today and coming out in this, I guess it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, which is kind of wonderful this time of year with the snow coming down. Again, my name is Phil Klein. I'm the director of the Amistad Project. And the 2020 general election witnessed an unprecedented and coordinated public-private partnership in swing states to improperly influence the election for Mr. Biden. This evidence that we're presenting today is present and available to all Americans so that they may see it and assess it, despite the effort of blue state governors and executive officials. The mainstream media has also tried to censor this evidence. Private interests and corporate oligarchs through social media have attempted to prevent the presentation of this evidence. Yet despite all of those efforts to prevent the American public from seeing the truth, America understands that there are serious problems with these elections, and its citizens are demanding that this not happen again, and that this investigation and the influence of private monies in this election through the purchase of local election officials and offices dictating how they manage the elections not ever happen again, and that we come to understand what occurred during this election. The report we are releasing today, entitled The Legitimacy and Effect of Private Funding in Federal and State Election Processes, was commissioned by the Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society and completed by Stillwater Technical Solutions, whose principal, James Carlson, is with me on the stage. James is a prolific author and writer, and he additionally has influenced public policy at the national level with the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, the United States Congress, and the White House. His team has been working on investigating the influence of private monies for some time now, and that report will be revealed to you today. The report details the flow of more than $500 million, more than the federal government expended in the CARES Act to fund the election during the COVID crisis, by over $100 million more than the federal appropriation. This effectively is a shadow government running our elections. $500 million into the hands of state and local officials who in turn allow those private organizations and private interests to have access to sensitive and private information of American citizens that was of value to political parties and monetized for interests on the left. It also reveals how private parties, by dangling the dollar bill, incentivize local election officials to violate state law, radically alter election procedures, act contrary to federal law, and violate federal law under the Help America Vote Act. It involved a government in a scheme to turn out a specific demographic of voter. And government engaging in turning out a specific demographic of voter is the opposite side of the same coin as government engaging in an effort to suppress turnout among a specific demographic. Such is not allowed under United States law and is a violation of equal protection and a violation of a prime precept in American law that all citizens need to be treated equally. As a legislator, I often had occasion to speak with groups of individuals who would often give me this refrain: "Why don't you run government like a business?" To which I replied, government's not designed to be a business. It has a much different objective than a business. Government must treat all citizens equally. That means there's inefficiencies in government. It is inefficient in an election to have more than one candidate. You know, we see efficiency in elections in the former Soviet Union when they had one candidate and the elections were run very swiftly and the results were known. That is not the role of government, to discriminate against certain persons and run the election efficient. It is to run it with fairness and transparency and access. And fairness and transparency and access are not the most efficient ways to count votes. It's much easier to let one person go in the room and determine the winner and come out and announce it than to actually allow America in the counting room. And instead, this time we ran government like a business, with $500 million of an oligarch's private monies dictating that America must be kicked out of the counting room, while the billionaire was allowed inside the counting room. This report and the evidence we're going to share today demonstrates that Mr. Zuckerberg's funds flowing through charities paid for the election judges, paid for the satellite offices to turn out the vote, paid for the machines, and dictated the policies that undermine state law. No. The real question we need to ask when we talk about the size of government is whether a specific function is part of government's role, or is it better done in the private sector? That's the real question. What is the scope of government's role? And government has the core responsibility of managing the elections. We don't put out elections for bid. We don't have elections brought to you by Coca-Cola. It is government's job to manage elections, and it must do so without a thumb on the scale and without private interests dictating how those elections are to be implemented. In other words, the question is not efficiency. The question is fairness. And the best antiseptic to a lack of fairness is transparency. Let me restate this because it is fundamental and an important point, or the very purpose of all of our election laws. The best protector of equality and fairness is transparency in the election process. Equality means counting every valid vote, and the flip side of the same coin of equality means not counting every invalid vote. You know, I'm reminded of when the United States first opened up the Oklahoma Territory for settlement. And at the time, a lot of people lined up on what was the border of Kansas, and they shot off a gun, and they allowed them to rush in. That's where we get Oklahoma Sooners, by the way. People cheated, rushed in early, and popped up and said, "I claim this land," the Sooners. But people rushed in, and they formed towns overnight. One of the first towns that was formed had to elect a mayor, so they had people stand in line, 2 lines. If you support this candidate, stand in this line. If you support this candidate, stand in this line. And then they appointed somebody to count as people walked by. And what they learned was some people were sneaking back in the line to be counted twice. And And that's when they elected their first sheriff to be able to manage that election. And the point being that with transparency, we can discover fraud. With boarded up windows and election officials kicking one party out, you can't discover fraud. And kicking a party out is a violation of election law. It is a direct violation of election law. And people don't violate the law without a reason. Now we have other means of transparency. And you might remember in our lifetime in the Bush-Gore battles, looking at the hanging chads. Debating whether a dimpled chad was an actual vote. That was valid because that election was transparent and America was in the counting room. You didn't get that opportunity in this election. You weren't in there. Mark Zuckerberg was. Again, the truth is that America was kicked out of the counting room and then a billionaire was allowed in. This billionaire, who gave over $500 million that we've been able to track and James has been able to identify in this election, poured most of that money through a charity entitled and named the Center for Tech and Civic Life. I will now call this Zuckerberg's charity because I believe that if you give $350 million to one charity, you have the right to call it after yourself. And as I mentioned, Zuckerberg paid for the election judges. He purchased the drop boxes contrary to state law. He ordered the consolidation of the counting facilities. Zuckerberg paid the local officials who boarded up the windows to the counting room. Zuckerberg money purchased the machines, Dominion and otherwise. And Zuckerberg money was contributed to secretaries of state like Michigan's Jocelyn Benson, who has fought transparency in this election by refusing to release computer logs and trying to bury forensic reports relating to those logs. That is not transparency. That is not the role of a Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's role is not to protect the vendor who manufactures the machines and distributes them. It's to forward the rights of Michiganders to a safe and fair election and a transparent election. Today, with this report and other evidence gathered by the Amistad Project, we're going to tell you this story. It is a story that should have already been told by the mainstream media. And I'm convinced, and if we can move the slide, I'm sorry. There we go. It's a story that should have been told by the mainstream media, and a story I'm convinced would have been told by the mainstream media if the billionaires had a different identity. If it was the Koch brothers, I don't believe that we would have to hold this news conference to reveal this truth. If it was the National Rifle Association putting in $500 million to purchase local election offices and incentivize officials to violate existing state law, we would not have to be holding this news conference. But because the mainstream media has a different agenda than the truth, we have to hold these news conferences and pray and hope that the American people will see past the censorship and the lies. There is no question whether there's evidence that dramatically impacted this election and incentivized people to violate election laws. That evidence has been demonstrated and it has been proven. We are obligated as Americans to share the truth when we uncover that truth. So if you can switch to the slides, please, I'm going to move this forward. As I mentioned, the American public can see through the fog and the smoke screen. Americans don't have confidence in this election. They know something was different. They know that the consolidated counting centers having work stoppages and the sudden flow of hundreds of thousands of ballots into one center, radically altering the result, is not normal. They know intuitively that putting hundreds of thousands of ballots in the drop box and not telling how those ballots got to the counting center breaks the chain of custody of the ballots and calls into question the legitimacy of the ballots. All of this knowledge has resulted in recently, if we can move the slide, this poll was given to us just yesterday. A Newsmax poll that shows that a majority of Americans believe that there was fraud in this election, despite the censorship. If you could move the slide, and you look at 9% are unsure. That means they have questions about the election. If you combine that with those who believe that there was fraud. That's 54% of Americans, contrasted with 45% of Americans. A majority of Americans believe there was fraud in this election. And let me tell you, to call into doubt this election, you don't have to prove fraud. That's a media concoction. You have to prove that election laws were violated. And that has been admitted to by officials. If we can move the slide, please. This is how the mainstream media is reporting this evidence, amid false claims of election fraud. Amid false claims, that is a pretense in the mainstream media before any report regarding the evidence, the admissions, the testimony of witnesses who say that there was fraud, say they participated in fraud, say they were trained to commit fraud, and election officials admitting they violated state election laws. Despite that, if we could go back to the screen, this precedes all reports. Amid false. That is a lie. That is a media lie. And Americans deserve better, and they demand that journalists live up to the proud heritage of their profession. I received a phone call from a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who asked me this question. He said, "Mr. Klein, how can you criticize the election process? You shouldn't criticize it. That undermines democracy." I laughed. The lifeblood of democracy is open discourse. The lifeblood of democracy is debate. The proud profession of a journalist is to criticize where government goes wrong. Every citizen in this nation has the right to stand up and proclaim criticism of its government. It is stunning to me that a member of the journalistic profession would say we shouldn't criticize the manner in which government conducted itself. That is stunning to me. Would we have ever uncovered Watergate? Would we have ever revealed the excesses of government in interning Japanese Americans? Would we have ever improved ourselves to the current condition where we recognize that not only men, but women, as well as those with different skin color, have inherent and intrinsic rights to be protected by government without criticism of the government? That is frightening to me, this push towards cultural hegemony that asked us all to shut up because criticizing the process undermines the process. No. Not in America, maybe in the former Soviet Union, maybe in totalitarian governments, maybe in those who want to hold on to power at all costs and don't want to reveal the truth. Maybe that criticism is valid from those persons. And what we see today is government managing itself in a way, unfortunately, that punishes criticism. I'll get to a little bit more of that in a little bit. If we can go back to the slides. The media. The media has had a false narrative all through this election to not, or to do everything possible to avoid looking at the truth, to avoid it. Let's talk about some evidence. To believe the media's portrayal that there is absolutely no evidence, I have to first explain the concept of evidence. If I showed up, as an investigator, and I oversaw the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and if I showed up at your home and I had a search warrant for documents that I believe revealed that you committed tax fraud, and it was a hot summer day and I'm outside your home and suddenly you board up the door, you don't allow us to come in, and I see smoke coming from the chimney, that's evidence. That's a pretty darn good conclusion that you're burning the documents so that the evidence will be destroyed. That is evidence, by the way. To believe what the media has to say, you have to believe that election officials confessing that they intentionally violated state law is not evidence of a problem in the elections. These admissions are found in every state. In Wisconsin, They admitted that they did not require identification on those who were indefinitely confined, and that they did not check if those persons who were indefinitely confined were actually indefinitely confined. Instead, they ordered election officials to accept the claim, contrary to state law. Drop boxes, contrary to state law in Georgia. Mobile ballot pickups without chain of custody, contrary to state law in Pennsylvania. The way that they cured ballots in Pennsylvania was contrary to state law. And courts have found this, by the way. They have found this to be true. Additionally, in Michigan, the manner in which they removed Republicans and the manner in which they cured ballots. And we'll speak about that more, and we'll give express details as it relates to these violations of law. So to believe the mainstream media, you have to believe that a confession is not evidence of what the person confessed to. You also have to believe, we can go to the next slide, that a box is a human being. You have to believe that a box is a human being. Let me give you an example. I testified before the Wisconsin legislature recently, and I testified after Mr. Knudsen, who's a Wisconsin election official. And he said, I know that the law says that we must deliver absentee ballots to the clerk, but what does that mean? What does clerk mean? Could it mean somebody that the clerk appointed? Or could it even mean a drop box? Now, you have to look to the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law is where the law lives and breathes, and the purpose is clear. Delivering an absentee ballot to a person, rather than an inanimate object, allows the person to verify the legitimacy of the absentee ballot. So, a person is not equal to a drop box. That is an admission of a willful and intentional evasion